Hello, and welcome to Dream Deception. If you could consider liking this video and subscribing, I would greatly appreciate it. It helps me keep going to create these types of spooky, horrifying, and scary videos. Alright, let's get to the stories. It started as a dream gig. I was a 28-year-old radio host with a knack for late-night banter. My voice had earned me a small but loyal following on WKTL 104.3. The station nestled in the backwaters of our sleepy town. The midnight hour, my show, thrived on weird stories and obscure tracks. A space for insomniacs, night shift workers, and the odd, curious soul. The station itself was unremarkable. A squat brick building on the edge of town, surrounded by an overgrown lot that hadn't seen a mower in years. My booth was a cocoon of dim red light, shelves of vinyl, and the comforting hum of equipment. The isolation never bothered me. It was part of the charm. But then came the calls. At first, they seemed like any other late-night chatter. People eager to share ghost stories or personal grievances under the anonymity of darkness. One night, a man called about seeing strange lights in the woods. Another. A woman whispered about a shadowy figure outside her window. Harmless, I thought. This was par for the course in my line of work. Then, 2 weeks ago, I got the first unsettling call. "You ever hear your own echo?" the man asked. His voice was raspy, strained, like he'd been smoking for decades. "Plenty of times," I replied, chuckling. "Kind of comes with the job." No, he interrupted, a hint of irritation cutting through. "Not like that. I mean, have you ever heard it before you spoke?" I paused, thrown off. "I'm not sure what you mean." "You will," he said, and the line went dead. For the first time, I felt a prick of unease. There was something about the way he spoke, the certainty in his tone that lodged itself in my chest. I brushed it off, chalking it up to another eccentric listener. But after that, the calls got stranger. One night, a woman sobbed incoherently for 3 minutes straight before hanging up. Another time, someone called in and stayed completely silent, save for a faint rhythmic tapping in the background. I even had a caller who seemed to mimic everything I said, repeating my words a fraction of a second after me. When I asked if they were using a voice modulator, they laughed. A high, brittle sound that made my skin crawl. I'd be lying if I said it didn't get to me. I started double-checking the locks on the studio door. I kept the blinds drawn even though no one ever came by at that hour. I told myself it was just a string of odd coincidences. People got weird at night, especially around Halloween. It was all part of the gig. Then the static began. It was subtle at first. A faint crackle beneath the music, barely noticeable unless you were listening for it. I assumed it was interference. Maybe the old equipment acting up. But it grew worse. The static started cutting into the broadcasts, slicing through songs and conversations like a blade. It wasn't random, though. It came in bursts, rhythmic and deliberate, like Morse code. I mentioned it to Greg, the station manager, but he just shrugged it off. "Equipment's old," he said. "We'll look into it next quarter. Budget's tight right now." Budget? Always the excuse. So I let it go. What else could I do? But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. That's when I started noticing the patterns. The static wasn't just noise. It carried something. Words. Fragments of sentences buried beneath the hiss and crackle. I spent hours listening back to recordings, isolating the sounds, trying to make sense of them. Most of it was gibberish, but every now and then a phrase would emerge, He's watching. Or don't look away. Or simply run. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. But the unease grew. The studio, once my sanctuary, started to feel oppressive. The red light that bathed the room felt less like ambiance and more like a warning. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old building settling made my heart race. Then came the night I saw him. It was a Thursday, just after 2 a.m. I'd finished a segment on urban legends and was queuing up a song when I glanced at the monitor that displayed the feed from the station's lone security camera. It showed the parking lot, dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp. Someone was standing there. He was tall and thin, his features obscured by the poor lighting. He didn't move, didn't look at the camera. He just stood there facing the building. I froze, my hand hovering over the console. My first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the irrational fear of seeming paranoid. Maybe it was curiosity. I stared at the monitor, waiting for him to move. Minutes passed, and he didn't budge. I decided to confront him. Grabbing the heavy flashlight I kept under the desk, I made my way to the lobby. The air felt heavier with each step, the silence oppressive. When I reached the glass doors, I hesitated. The parking lot was empty. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the lot, the surrounding trees, the dark highway beyond. Nothing. No sign of him. But when I returned to the booth, my hand still trembling, the monitor showed him standing in the same spot, staring up at the camera. I didn't go back out. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on in my apartment, the TV playing softly in the background. I told myself it was a prank, that someone was messing with me. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The next week was a blur of static, strange calls and sleepless nights. My appetite vanished. My coworkers noticed, but I waved off their concern. Just busy, I'd say, forcing a smile. But the truth was, I felt like I was unraveling. The boundary between reality and delusion blurred. Then, 2 nights ago, it escalated. The show started like any other. I was halfway through an interview with a local paranormal investigator when the static returned, louder and more insistent than ever. It drowned out our voices, forcing me to cut to a commercial.
When we look at this dream, it actually began early on in your voice. It has many markers.
When I returned, the caller was gone. In their place, a new voice crackled through the headphones. "You're not alone," it said. The voice was deep, distorted, and eerily calm. "He's coming." I ripped off the headphones and stared at the console. The phone lines were dead. The voice shouldn't have been there. My hands shook as I put the headphones back on, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The static surged, then faded. Silence. I sat there, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something, anything. Minutes passed. Then the lights flickered, and the door to the booth creaked open. I froze. The hallway beyond was dark, a yawning void. I stared at the open door, every nerve screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. My breath came in shallow gasps as I waited, eyes locked on the doorway. Then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding blackness, moving toward me, slow, deliberate. It stopped just inside the room, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze boring into me. "Leave," it whispered. The voice was the same as the one on the call, but now it was closer, more intimate. "Before it's too late." Something snapped inside me. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it wildly, the beam slicing through the dark, but the shadow was gone. The room was empty. The door was shut.
I didn't finish the show. I left the station without locking up, drove straight home, and locked myself inside. My hands are still shaking as I write this. I don't know what's happening, but I can't go back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever.
But as I sit here trying to make sense of it all, my phone buzzes on the table. A new voicemail. With trembling hands, I press play. The message is short. Just 3 words spoken in that same distorted voice.
He's already here.
Story 2. My job was simple. Cue up tracks, take the occasional call, and fill dead air with whatever rambling monologue I could muster. Midnight to 4 a.m. wasn't exactly prime time, but I liked the quiet, the solitude. It gave me space to think, even if the paycheck barely covered my rent. I arrived at the station just before midnight. The building was as nondescript as ever, a single-story concrete block tucked behind a shuttered diner on the edge of town. The parking lot was empty except for my car, as usual. The only light came from the weak glow of the neon station sign, flickering faintly in the cold autumn air. Inside, the station felt quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of every creak, every groan of the building. I shrugged it off and headed to the booth. The red on-air light above the door buzzed faintly as I switched it on. I settled into the chair, adjusted my headphones, and flipped through the stack of records I'd pulled for the night. Everything felt normal, routine even. But routines have a way of lulling you into a false sense of security.
The first hour passed without incident. A few tracks, a weather update, some half-hearted banter about the latest town gossip. Nobody called in, but that wasn't unusual. Most nights, the phone stayed silent. I liked it that way. It meant fewer awkward conversations with the kind of people who thought 2 a.m. was the perfect time to air their grievances about potholes or local politics. Then, at 1:13 a.m., the phone rang.
I frowned. The sound of the phone was jarring, cutting through the ambient hum of the equipment. It took me a moment to react. When I finally picked up, I was greeted by silence.
WKRV.
I said, trying to keep my tone neutral.
You're on the air.
Nothing. Just a faint crackling, like static.
Hello?
I tried again.
Still nothing. I was about to hang up when I heard it, a low, raspy whisper.
Do you hear it? Hear what?
I asked, my voice sharper than I intended.
The line went dead. I stared at the receiver for a moment before placing it back in its cradle. Prank calls weren't unheard of, but something about the voice stuck with me. There was an edge to it, a quiet intensity that made my skin crawl. I shook it off and went back to the show, chalking it up to some bored teenager with nothing better to do. But then the static started. It was subtle at first, just a faint crackle underneath the music. I thought it was a bad connection or maybe interference from the old equipment. The station's setup wasn't exactly state-of-the-art. But as the night wore on, the static grew louder. It didn't seem random, though. It came in bursts, rhythmic and deliberate, like some kind of pattern. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my playlist, but it was impossible to tune out. At 2:07 a.m., the phone rang again.
This time I hesitated before answering. Something about the silence earlier had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. But curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the receiver.
WKRV.
I said, my voice tight.
Listen.
The voice whispered. It was the same as before, low and raspy.
It's coming through. Can't you hear it? What are you talking about?
I demanded. The static on the line grew louder, drowning out the voice. Then, Just as suddenly as it had started, the call ended. I slammed the receiver down, my heart pounding. The rational part of my brain told me it was still just a prank, but the unease in my chest was harder to dismiss. I turned back to the console, ready to cue up the next track, when the lights flickered. Not a brief flicker, like when a bulb is on its last legs, but a slow, deliberate dimming that left the room bathed in a faint, sickly glow. The hum of the equipment wavered, and for a moment I thought the power might go out entirely. But it didn't. The light stabilized, the hum returned, and everything seemed normal again. Except it wasn't.
The static had changed. It was no longer faint background noise. It was louder, more defined, and layered with something else. A voice. It was faint, almost imperceptible, buried beneath the crackle. But it was there. I leaned in closer, adjusting the volume, trying to make it out. The words were garbled, fragmented, but I caught pieces.
Not alone. Watching. Listen.
A chill ran down my spine. I yanked off my headphones and stared at the console, my mind racing. This wasn't interference, it couldn't be. Someone was... what? Trying to communicate through the static? The thought was absurd, but no more absurd than the alternative. That I was imagining it. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe the equipment was picking up a signal from another station. It wasn't uncommon for frequencies to overlap, especially with old hardware like ours. But deep down, I didn't believe that. At 2:43 a.m., the phone rang again. I didn't want to answer it. Every instinct screamed at me to let it ring, to ignore it. But my hand moved on its own, lifting the receiver.
WKRV.
I said, my voice barely above a whisper.
This time the voice was clearer.
It's here. What's here?
I asked, my throat dry. The line went dead. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the console's dials. My breath came in shallow gasps as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I finally clicked it on, the beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the cramped booth. Everything looked the same. Nothing out of place. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. I scanned the room, the hallway beyond the booth, even the tiny window that looked out onto the parking lot. Nothing.
I wanted to leave. Every fiber of my being told me to grab my keys and run. But I couldn't. Something kept me rooted in place. A morbid curiosity mingling with my fear. Clutching the flashlight, I stepped out of the booth and into the hallway. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, guiding me like a beacon. The hallway felt longer than it should have, the shadows stretching and twisting in the dim light. When I reached the storage room, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening.
I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, summoning what little courage I had left, I turned the handle and pushed the door open.
The room was empty. Just shelves of old equipment and boxes of outdated records. But the air was heavy, oppressive, and my skin prickled with a sense of wrongness. I scanned the room with the flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest.
And that's when I saw it.
In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam, something moved. It was subtle, a shifting of shadows, but it was enough to send me stumbling back. The beam of light wavered as I tried to steady my hand, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something. A figure, impossibly thin and unnaturally still, watching me from the darkness. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. I didn't stop until I was back in the booth, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The console was still lit, the static louder than ever. The voice was back, clearer now, almost conversational. "Why did you leave?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mouth was dry, my mind racing. The voice chuckled low and guttural. "You can't escape."
And then the static cut out. The lights came back on. Everything was normal again, except it wasn't. I could still feel it. That presence watching, waiting.
I didn't finish the shift. I left the station, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my car keys. As I drove home, the radio crackled, faint whispers threading through the static. I turned it off, but the whispers lingered, echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back to the station. I don't know if I ever will. But even now, sitting in my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. That whatever was in that building followed me. And every time the static returns, I hear the voice, whispering just beneath the surface. "You can't escape."